In the winter of 1923, on a small farm outside Intercourse, Pennsylvania, an Amish elder named after his grandfather was doing something that most of his English neighbors had already stopped doing. He was standing in his root cellar, holding a lantern, looking at shelves lined floor to ceiling with food his family had grown. Dried beans in clay jars, canned tomatoes still red from summer, cured squash stacked like firewood, sweet potatoes packed in sawdust. And outside, under 2 feet of snow, the ground was already prepared for next year. His family was not going to the store. Not in January, not in March, not ever, really. And that is the part that supermarkets and the industry behind them have spent the last 100 years hoping you would forget. This video is about 5 crops, 5 specific crops that Amish families across Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Holmes County, Ohio, and LaGrange County, Indiana, have grown in an unbroken line for more than 2 centuries. Not because they are stubborn, not because they are behind, but because these 5 crops, planted and managed the way their great-great-grandparents taught them, make it possible to eat from your own land every single day of the year. 365 days. No supermarket, no supply chain, no dependency. And here is the question that is going to stay open through this entire video. What is the one thing all 5 of these crops have in common that makes the system work? Because each of them, alone, is just a vegetable. Together, planted the right way, managed the right way, preserved the right way, they become something else entirely. They become freedom. And by the end of this, you will know exactly what your grandfather understood and what someone decided you should not. Think about what your garden looks like in February or in November. For most American backyard growers today, it is mostly bare ground, maybe some frost-killed stalks still standing, and a trip to the grocery store every other day. That is not how it has always been. That is a choice that was made for you by people who had a financial interest in making you dependent. But before we get to who made that choice and when, you need to understand what the alternative actually looks like on the ground. Donald Craybill, the scholar at Elizabethtown College, who has spent decades documenting Amish life in Pennsylvania, has noted in his research that Amish households in Lancaster County maintain a level of food self-sufficiency that is genuinely rare in modern American life, not as a religious requirement, but as a cultural inheritance. The garden is not a hobby in an Amish household, it is infrastructure, and it is run with a precision and a long-term logic that most modern gardeners have never been taught to think about, because nobody selling fertilizer or seed packets has any interest in teaching you to be independent. The first crop in this system is not what you might expect. It is not corn. It is not tomatoes. It is the dry bean. Specifically, the kind of heirloom dry bean that Amish families in Holmes County have been saving seed from for generations. Not the commodity bean, not the canned bean from a factory in Illinois. The dry bean that your great-grandmother would have recognized, the one that stores at room temperature for 2, 3, even 4 years without losing nutritional value, the one that provides complete protein through the winter months when nothing else is growing. Amish households in the plain communities of Ohio have historically grown multiple varieties side by side, selecting for the best performers every year from their own saved seed. No patent, no licensing agreement, no annual purchase from a corporation, and this is where the historical record starts getting uncomfortable. In 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Bowman versus Monsanto Company that a farmer in Indiana had violated patent law by saving and replanting soybeans he had purchased. Vernon Hugh Bowman was 75 years old. He had been farming all his life. The court ruled against him unanimously. Think about what that moment meant. The oldest agricultural practice in human history, saving seed from your own harvest, was formally criminalized for patented varieties. The Amish did not switch to patented beans. They kept their heirloom lines. And that is not an accident. That is a decision made by communities that understood exactly what was at stake. If you have a garden and you are tired of being told what to buy, drop the number 47 inches in the comments below. Or better yet, tell us what state you are gardening in. Let us see how many of us are out here doing this. The second crop in the Amish 365-day system is the winter squash, not the decorative pumpkin you put on your porch in October. The serious storage squash, the Hubbard, the butternut, the long pie pumpkin that Amish families in Lancaster County have grown since before the Civil War. A mature Hubbard squash, properly cured, will sit in a cool, dry cellar and feed your family well into April. The curing process is not complicated. After harvest, you hold the squash at around 80 degrees for 10 days to let the skin harden, and then you move it somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees with low humidity. No electricity required. No refrigeration. Amish farmhouses were built with this in mind. The root cellar was not an afterthought. It was the whole point. What destroyed the winter squash in American home gardens was not disease, it was not pests. It was convenience culture, pushed hard by the food industry, starting in the 1950s. When Clarence Birdseye's frozen food technology scaled up after World War II, and when supermarket chains expanded aggressively through the post-war suburbs, the argument the industry made was simple. Why store squash in a cellar when you can buy it frozen in a bag? What they did not tell you was that the frozen bag requires a cold chain, a distribution network, a corporate supplier, and your continued dependence on all of it. The squash in your cellar requires none of that. It just requires that you grew it. Here is what the industry spent decades hoping you would never figure out. The root cellar is not primitive technology. It is perfect technology. It requires no energy input after construction. It uses the thermal mass of the earth to maintain a near constant temperature. Amish families in Indiana have been using the same cellars their great-grandparents built, lined with fieldstone, with earthen floors that breathe, that maintain 52 to 58 degrees year-round without any mechanical help. That is not behind the times. That is engineering so good it never needed improving. The third crop is the one most American gardeners grow, but almost none of them preserve correctly. The tomato, not as a fresh vegetable, as a preserved staple. Amish women in Lancaster County have historically put up hundreds of quarts of tomatoes every summer, and they are not doing it for nostalgia. They are doing it because a jar of whole canned tomatoes from your own garden, processed in a water bath canner with nothing but the tomato and a pinch of citric acid, is a completely shelf-stable food source that lasts 2 years or more. The USDA will tell you 1 year for peak quality. Amish grandmothers will tell you they have opened 3-year-old jars that were perfectly fine. The gap between those two answers is worth thinking about. The industrial canning industry that emerged in the mid-20th century was not built to help you be independent. It was built to replace your independence with a product. When Campbell's Soup and Del Monte and the canneries behind them lobbied successfully to dominate the American kitchen, what got pushed out was not just a practice, it was a skill set. A generation of American women who knew how to put up 50 quarts of tomatoes in a weekend was replaced, deliberately and systematically, by a generation taught to open a can. That is not a natural evolution. That is a market being built by eliminating the competition, which was your own kitchen. The fourth crop enters the system quietly, and it is the one that holds the whole thing together in a way that most people do not see until they understand the soil side of this equation. The potato. Specifically, the small farm potato, grown in deep, organically enriched soil, stored in a dark root cellar between 40 and 50 degrees, viable for 6 months from harvest without sprouting heavily. Amish farms in Holmes County, Ohio, have historically rotated potatoes through their garden beds in a sequence that prevents the soil depletion and disease pressure that devastates commercial potato operations. They do not use nematicides. They do not use the systemic fungicides that conventional potato growers apply multiple times a season. They use rotation. They use green manures. They use the logic of a living soil that has been fed with compost and animal manure for 200 years. Here is a number worth sitting with. The average American family today spends roughly $5,000 a year on groceries. In 1950, adjusted for inflation, it was closer to 30% of household income. Today, it is around 10%. And that sounds like progress until you realize what was traded for that number. Land, skills, time, community, the ability to feed yourself without a credit card and a working highway system. A family growing these 5 crops the Amish way can produce a substantial portion of their annual food supply on a quarter acre. A quarter acre. That is smaller than most suburban backyards. But the part they really did not want you to know comes next. Because the story of how this system was suppressed is not vague. It has dates, It has names. It has a policy. In the early 1970s, Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon and Ford, implemented what became known informally as the Get Big or Get Out policy. Butz pushed American farmers aggressively toward monoculture, toward commodity production, toward the industrial model. He famously told farmers to plant from fence row to fence row. Small, diversified farms, exactly the kind the Amish had always operated, were explicitly not the future he was building. Federal price supports were restructured to favor scale. Land-grant universities shifted their extension programs toward industrial methods. The USDA, the agency theoretically tasked with supporting American farmers, became functionally a promotional arm for the industrial agriculture model. Amish farmers, because they do not take federal subsidies, because they do not participate in most federal programs on principle, were simply not part of that conversation. They kept doing what they had always done, and what they had always done kept working. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to do it now. This channel makes videos like this every week about the methods the industry buried, the wisdom the Amish kept, and the food independence most Americans gave up without ever realizing it was being taken from them. The fifth crop in the system is the one that closes the year, the one that fills the gap between the last of the stored winter squash and the first spring greens. And it is the one that most backyard growers have never seriously considered as a staple. It is the sweet potato. Not the orange supermarket sweet potato that was bred for uniformity and transport. The heirloom sweet potato that Amish families in southern Indiana have grown for generations, some varieties brought north by families who traded with their Appalachian neighbors, some preserved in seed-saving networks that run quietly through the plain communities of the Midwest. A sweet potato, stored properly, between 55 and 60 degrees in dry conditions, will hold from October through February without significant nutritional loss. It is dense in calories. It is rich in beta-carotene. It grows in poor soil that other crops will not tolerate. It laughs at the kind of clay-heavy, compacted backyard soil that defeats most gardeners. And here is what the industry spent money ensuring you would not put together. These 5 crops, dry beans, winter squash, canned tomatoes, potatoes, and sweet potatoes, cover your protein, your carbohydrates, your fat-soluble vitamins, and your caloric base from harvest through the following spring. They are not 5 random vegetables. They are a system designed over 2 centuries of trial and error by communities who had no fallback, who could not drive to a Walmart if the harvest failed, and who therefore had every incentive to get it exactly right. A farmer in Holmes County, Ohio, 73 years old, whose grandfather learned this system from his grandfather in the late 1890s, was documented by researchers studying Amish agricultural practices as saying something simple that is worth staying with. He said his family had never, in living memory, bought a vegetable at a store between October and April. Not because they were wealthy, not because they had special land, because they grew the right things in the right amounts and they knew how to keep them. Now close the loop. Remember the question from the beginning of this video: what do all 5 of these crops have in common? What is the single thread that runs through the dry bean, the winter squash, the canned tomato, the potato, the sweet potato, and makes them a system instead of a list? It is storability. Every single one of these crops can be kept without refrigeration, without electricity, without a corporation between you and your food for months to a year or more after harvest. That is not a coincidence. That is a design principle. The Amish did not accidentally end up growing 5 storable crops. They chose them generation after generation, because storability is what makes the difference between eating from your garden 3 months a year and eating from it 12. The industry replaced storability with convenience. And convenience, it turns out, is just a word for dependency that does not know its own name. The post-World War II American food system was engineered, and that word is not too strong, engineered around perishability. Perishable food requires cold chain. Cold chain requires refrigerated trucks, distribution centers, retail stores with electricity, and consumers who shop regularly. Every link in that chain is a business. Every business in that chain profits from your inability to feed yourself from your own land. The synthetic fertilizer boom that followed the repurposing of wartime munitions chemistry after 1945 The pesticide revolution built on organophosphate chemistry, originally developed for nerve agents, the hybrid seed programs that produced high-yield varieties that did not store or reproduce reliably, these were not developments that happened to push small farm self-sufficiency aside. They were developments that made it economically irrational for most American farmers to practice it. The Amish, again, were simply not playing that game. John Hostetler, the sociologist who studied Amish communities for decades and whose landmark work on Amish society remains foundational, documented the degree to which Amish resistance to technology was not anti-progress in the way outsiders assumed. It was a deliberate communal evaluation of what a given technology would do to the fabric of their community and their independence. Electrification, for example. When the Rural Electrification Act brought power lines to rural America in the 1930s and 1940s, Amish communities evaluated it and declined, not because electricity was evil, but because accepting it meant accepting a utility company, a monthly bill, and a dependency on an external system that they did not control. That logic, applied to agriculture, meant they never handed their seed supply to Monsanto. They never borrowed to buy the latest chemical program. They never became customers in a system that needed them to stay customers. And here's the thing that should make you stop and think. The Amish were not wrong. The diversified small farms of America that were methodically replaced by the industrial model through policy, through subsidy, through the deliberate withdrawal of practical knowledge from rural extension programs, were not replaced because they stopped working. They were replaced because they worked too well. A family that grows dry beans and winter squash and puts up 200 quarts of tomatoes and stores 50 pounds of sweet potatoes does not need the same things that a family buying everything at a supermarket needs. And someone, somewhere, was paying very close attention to that math. What does it say about a country that in 1900, according to agricultural records, roughly 40% of the American population was directly involved in food production, and by 2000 that number had fallen to less than 2%? It says that somewhere in that 100 years, a decision was made. Not by farmers, not by families, by markets, by policy, by the slow and systematic defunding of the skills and knowledge that made self-sufficiency possible. The Amish did not go along with that decision, and they still eat from their gardens in January. Your grandfather probably knew most of this, not as history, as practice, as the thing you did before winter because that was how you ate. The root cellar, the bean rows, the canning jars lined up on the basement shelf in September. That knowledge did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because it became economically inconvenient for a very specific set of industries, and those industries were better than any generation before them at marketing their replacement. You can get it back, not as nostalgia, not as a hobby, as a real, functioning, tested system that has been proven on working farms in Lancaster County, in Holmes County, and LaGrange County for more than 200 years without interruption. 5 crops, planted with intention, preserved with knowledge, managed with the logic of a household that cannot afford to fail. The Amish are not waiting for permission. They are not waiting for the USDA to revise its guidelines. They are not waiting for the Agricultural Extension Office to update its recommendations. They are doing what their grandparents taught them in the same soil, with the same saved seed, eating from the same root cellar design, because they never let anyone convince them that depending on someone else was the same thing as progress. Leave a comment below and tell us what your grandfather grew in his garden, or what your family lost when the supermarket replaced the root cellar. And here is a question worth answering honestly. Do you know, right now, today, where your family would get its food if the supply chain stopped for 60 days? The Amish know. They have always known. We read every single comment. If this video opened your eyes to what got taken from you, give it a like. Share it with someone who still believes there is no other way, because there is another way. There always was. And it has been growing quietly in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana this whole time, waiting for the rest of America to